Shall we pray?
We should pray.
Okay. In the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit.
Amen.
Heavenly King, Comforter, Spirit of truth, everywhere present and filling all things, treasury of blessings, and giver of life, come and dwell within us, cleanse us of all stain, and save our souls, O gracious one. Glory to Jesus Christ.
Glory to him forever.
All right.
So we begin 7 weeks with 1 Corinthians this week, and then 6 weeks following the 6-week format of the book. And this is quite different from what we did last time, which was Jonah and Ruth, where it was a couple of stories. This is a letter. And when we were looking at Jonah and Ruth, we remarked on the fact that nobody is really certain when they were written, even what century they were written in. There's a lot of discussion about that and no certain information in the books themselves. Here, we know when 1 Corinthians was written, pretty close, maybe around the year 53 or 54. And we know when Paul was first in Corinth, it was around the year 50-51. So, and since we have a particular place, Corinth, we can look at Corinth and learn actually quite a bit about the background of the letter and what were the situations that Paul was dealing with, what was going on with the Christians in Corinth, what was life like there, what were the challenges of being Christians, so on. So today is a visit to Corinth, and then the other days, the other weeks. So we meet next week, but then we don't meet every week to do that. If you have a little more time, the second thing that would be very good to do is to read Act 18, which gives account of Paul arriving in Corinth. And coming back to dating, the governor of the province of Achaia, which is Corinth is the capital of Gallio, who's in office. The governors in that kind of province were only in office for a year. And the year can be dated. So it was, I think, 50 on our calendar, 50 to 51, spring 51 as one place there. So,
Cool.
So we know who wrote it. We know he wrote it 3 or 4 years after that from Ephesus, apparently. It's the most general view. We even know some of the people he wrote to because they're named in 1 Corinthians or in Acts or in Romans. So this gets us right down into the, we're in a very specific situation with particular people here. So, other thoughts as we get started? Okay, so I'm going to do conduct a tour to Corinth here. Not everybody is interested in historical details, let alone in looking at old stones. But I would say that this can be very instructive for understanding 1 Corinthians and reading it with appreciation. So I suggest you pay close attention. Okay, so my other suggestion for next week is, if you have time, sit down and read all of 1 Corinthians in one sitting. We always, in the liturgy, we always hear a little piece, a little piece, a little piece. Very hard to put it together. And in this book, we're only going to read 6 portions because it's kind of a long letter, and we're not going to try to read and talk about the entire letter in our, in the sessions. But it's really a good idea to read the whole thing. I mean, it's long for a letter, but it's not long for something to read. It's really only a few pages. So if you have time, I'd say read through the whole letter this week. Okay, so All right, so I'm going to fly through this, but if you want to stop at any point and talk, let me know, okay? Otherwise, I'm just going to keep going. Okay, so Corinth, where is Corinth? It's at the southern end of the isthmus that connects north and south of Greece. It's quite close to the southern end of the isthmus. This map shows a canal, but the canal was not there in the first century. This was a good place for trade because trade running north-south through Greece had to go past Corinth. And also sea trade came to Corinth because some shipping from the east would come to the Corinth area, and then other shipping from Corinth would head west. So it was a central place for trade. Corinth had a port, Cenchreae, which comes into the New Testament, just to the east, and it had another port to the northwest, Lycaon.
So it's just a little southwest of Athens? Is that what I saw in the larger map? Am I reading that correctly?
Yes.
Okay, just one.
West.
Oh, just straight west?
Really west,
Straight west,
yeah.
okay.
On the expressway, it's about an hour. Right, Martin?
Now it is, yeah.
Yeah.
Not back then.
Not that- The expressway wasn't
There would
there.
be more than one day's walk.
Even since we were there, it's gotten much more modern.
So there was a lot of trade. There was also manufacturing. Corinth was known for manufacturing bronze things, like this mirror is from Corinth. It's no longer shiny, so it's not reflective. And also because it was the capital of the province of Achaia, which took in all of southern Greece, there was government there and tax revenues flowed in. And people who lived in Corinth were landowners. They owned land in the surrounding agricultural areas, and they had rents and revenues from their agricultural land. So in one sense, Corinth was a prosperous place, but as we'll talk about, there was severe economic inequality. So really only a small minority of the people in Corinth were wealthy. And the population was maybe 80 to 100,000 in the first century, roughly, which would make it a considerable city for its time. So today, it's a partially...
Another question about Athens.
Yes.
How would it have compared to Athens at the time?
I don't know.
Okay.
I don't know how large Athens was. I mean, it was more extensive physically, but I don't know about the population. I would suspect Athens had a higher population, but I don't actually know that.
It's just kind of fascinating to me. You know, we have a letter to the Romans, to Rome,
Right.
but then in terms of fame, Athens is far more famous than Corinth.
Right.
But we don't have a letter to Athens, and so it's
Right.
kind of interesting that this city, which was right there, right in the neighborhood, kind of, it was apparently where the Christian community was established more so than in Athens in the first century.
In Acts, Luke doesn't tell us how long Paul is in
He
Athens,
does go there.
but he does indicate that he's in Corinth for longer, I think for like a year and a half. So it seems that he's in Corinth longer. And also the account that he gives of Paul in Athens is, well, he's there, he's waiting for, he's thrown out of Thessalonica and then thrown out of Berea. He comes to Athens, and then he wants to know what's going on with the Christians back in Thessalonica. So you get the impression that he's just waiting in Athens to get news of the Christians in Thessalonica, not there for very long.
Right.
And
You also get the impression that he doesn't have much success preaching the gospel in Athens, right?
yeah, well, Luke tells he talks to a few people on at least on one occasion, and a handful of people are interested. But that's all Luke says. He doesn't say that a real community got started.
Also, is it my bias? Like in their day, would Corinth have been just as famous and well established as Athens?
No, Athens was a more famous
It was
place.
already the case then.
Right.
That was the prominent city,
Right.
the famous city.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Oh.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Moving back to Corinth. Okay, so today it's a partially excavated archaeological site and not the most impressive ruins in the world. But it's instructive. So from the excavations, it's possible to do a kind of reconstruction of the downtown area, the central city, which is the area that's been excavated. And so that's what we have, is this kind of aerial view. So in Paul's day, the main entrance to the city was here. This is coming from the north, actually. So you'd enter into an avenue on both sides with large colonnades, and behind the colonnades, shops and workshops. What remains today is the road, but none of the colonnades or the workshops. But we can look at other Greco-Roman cities of the same era and get an idea of what it might look like. Jerash, Gerasa in modern Jordan still has a couple of these colonnaded streets that we can look at. It gives you an idea of what the entrance to Corinth would have looked like. Am I in the way? Is that better? Would have looked like at the time. Very impressive. To get a picture of the shops and the workshops, we can go to actually a slightly different location in Corinth. This building here was a market building, and there are remains of the shops that were there. These are maybe like 12, 15 feet wide. They're not very big. And this is a drawing of what they would have looked like. Downstairs, you have a space for craft work, storage of goods, sales. In this case, what's being illustrated is a room for cooking and serving food. It's a little fast food joint. The guy downstairs, you can see, is behind the counter. And he's got rooms for heated pots of food there on the counter. And then you'd have a half loft, maybe 8 feet or so above the floor, which was for family eating and sleeping. So in such a shop, you might have a couple with their children and a few household slaves who would live and work there. Part of the reason for showing this is that Paul worked in Corinth, probably in a shop like this. Luke tells us that on arriving in the city, Paul met a Jew named Aquila, a native of Pontus, which is in today northern Turkey, who had recently come from Italy with his wife Priscilla because Claudius had ordered all the Jews to leave Rome. So they're a Jewish couple who become Christian believers. He went to visit them, and because he practiced the same trade, stayed with them and worked, for they were tent makers by trade. So this was Paul's line of work, and it fit his apostolic traveling lifestyle, working with canvas and leather, repairing awnings and tents and that sort of thing. Was a mobile craft. You just needed a few tools. You could carry them around in a little bag. And wherever you traveled, you would find work because there was always things to be fixed or things to be made like that. So in a shop like this also, it would lend itself to a little apostolic activity as you worked. Working with canvas and leather are quiet activities. And you can sit and talk with people as they come and go. Welcome.
Hello.
And share the gospel while you earn a few pennies. And probably a few pennies is all that Paul would earn doing that. This was not highly skilled work, and so you did not get highly paid. You were a casual manual worker, basically. So you would earn enough in a day to keep you going for a day or so. And you probably have to work long hours to meet your needs. So if your work hours fluctuated, perhaps because you wanted to go off and do other apostolic things during the day, then you'd earn less money, and the next day you might not have enough money to buy food. And in 1 Corinthians 4:11, Paul says, "To this very hour we go hungry." Where he would have slept in a place, maybe on the ground floor on bales or piles of leather. Okay, so returning to Main Street, if you come in the main entrance, you're going down the main drag there. On the left, you would come to another kind of market. Here's the ruins today. An inscription on the ruins indicates this is where the butcher shops were located. That's the word macellum in Latin, which means a market for meat, fish, produce. possibly the reconstruction of an artist's reconstruction of the market of Pompeii gives an idea of what the one at Corinth would have looked like. This meat market enters into 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 25. Paul takes up the issue of what if you buy meat in the meat market. So look at that when we look at the book. Also, going back to the inscription, Macellum is a Latin word, even though Corinth is in Greece. So this is something we can talk about also a little bit. Okay, so in Corinth, as in all of the Greco-Roman cities, there's a dizzying disparity of economic resources among the population. So you have like maybe the top 3% maybe are able to live an extravagant lifestyle. Another 7%, maybe, these are approximate numbers, are well off. They're doing okay. And then just about everybody else is quite poor, because subsistence here means having enough money that you can buy enough food to have enough calories intake per day to maintain human life. So people who are at subsistence are like, some days they're above and some days they're below. The people who are near subsistence are generally trending above that line, but not too far above. And the people who are below it are not getting enough to eat. And you get weak, and you get sick, and you die. So there's a big turnover in the population of the bottom group. So Paul, working with leather and canvas, would have been in the subsistence level, along with a large proportion of the people in Corinth that he would be bringing the gospel to. From 1 Corinthians, we get the impression that the economic profile of the Christian community followed the profile of the city as a whole. Paul says, not many of you were wise by human standards, indicating education. Not many were powerful, not many were of noble birth. And he also talks about the community consisting largely of those who are the lowly and the despised. So those are the people that are in the 90% there. And this has big implications for the Christian community in Corinth, as we will see. Now, the differences between the elite and everybody else were not just economic. They were distinctions between the nobility and the ordinary folk, and these distinctions were written into the law. The term the betters and the lessers were legal terms that distinguished which the two big groups in society. And they've recently been reinforced by legislation under the Emperor Augustus. So the plaza, the agora, were something that was accessible only to the people who were in the upper class. If you were in the lower class, you couldn't bring cases in court. And if you had a legal problem, you'd have to have a patron in the upper class who was your friend, who would maybe take your case for you. In order to be on the city council, the city council chamber was here, a requirement was a minimum substantial annual revenue for your family. Below that line, you couldn't serve on the council, even if you were a citizen. Oh, by the way, you can see it's curved in the back, and there would have been a bench built into the curvature there. And when the Christians centuries later started building churches with apses at the back, they followed the same model and had a bench in the apse and seating for the clergy in the back of the apse area of the church. Social class in Corinth, continuing on this theme, was reflected in public behavior in various ways. Corinth, like all these Greco-Roman cities, had a theater, which would seat a few thousand people. The ruins are not impressive in Corinth, but we could look elsewhere. This was a theater in Bosra, now in southern Syria, which is substantially preserved. The Corinthian would have been like this. Seating in the theater was distinguished by class designations. The best seats were at the ground floor, where the wealthy people would sit, and they would actually have chairs brought in and placed on the ground floor for them, where they would be closest to the performers. Then in sections behind them going up the seating, first free persons, people who were born free. Then freed persons, persons who had been slaves but had been set free. And then members of various occupations, moving down the socioeconomic level depending on the respectability or lack of it in your occupation, and finally slaves in the top seating. So entering the theater in Corinth, you would be able to see the social differentiation of the Corinthians before you and where they're sitting, and also in the splendor or raggedness of the clothes that they're wearing.
And Paul would have been free, right?
Yes.
Right.
Yes, because he's a citizen.
Right.
Well, freedmen were citizens. But, yes, I don't think there's any indication that Paul himself had been enslaved.
Right.
It's possible his parents had been. Because if you were a slave of a Roman citizen, when you were set free, you gained citizenship. You had a lot of social disabilities being a freed person, but you did gain citizenship and you pass that on to your children. So, so in cities like Corinth, the upper and the lower class people did not mix socially. Remember, so the different classes related on a patron-client basis or on a master-slave basis, but not on an equal social basis at all. And this is important for understanding the problems which arise in the Christian community in Corinth, which we will encounter in 1 Corinthians. For example, there's a disharmony in how they celebrate the Lord's Supper, which seems to have something to do with differences in social class among the members of the community. So in this highly status-conscious society, the men engaged in a continuous competition for honor, for enlarging their prestige. And wealth was seen, having real wealth was a means of having a more luxurious life, but the reason to have everything, to have a luxurious life, to have everything, was to gain honor, to have glory. So, for example, politics, we looked at the city council chamber, politics was an arena for gaining honor. In Latin, the word honor means both public office and honor. The two were so closely associated, they have the same word. The reason that you sought to hold an office in the city government was because it was an honor. It gave you prestige. And there was in Roman cities, there was even what was called a cursus honorum, a course of honors, like an ascending set of city offices that you would attempt to hold in your lifetime. So in politics, it wasn't so much a conflict over policy, more personality. And elections were a means of increasing your celebrity and your reputation and humiliating your opponents. So was litigation. Lawsuits were sometimes just an opportunity to shame your opponent. If you have enough money, you are going to bring in a really expensive, fancy, rhetorically refined attorney, and he's going to demolish your opponent in front of everybody and make a fool of him. You're going to win the case. The actual case involved may not be the main thing that's of concern. And we'll see in 1 Corinthians, the members of the community are taking each other to court. So there's some background here in the culture. Those who could afford to do so enhance their glory by funding public infrastructure, like paying for buildings or streets or fountains, or paying for civic events, like paying for the sacrifices of animals and the other food and drink for big festivals. For example, one wealthy man paid for a fine pavement, or perhaps it was actually part of a staircase, which was near the theater, and there was an inscription to attest to his generosity to the city. It says in Latin, Erastus, for his aedileship, laid the pavement at his own expense. So the aedile was the director of public works in a Roman city government. And again, note that the inscription is in Latin. So, so Erastus shelled out a lot of money for this. And the reason that he did it wasn't just he was public spirited, it's because he wanted to get the credit for it, and lasting credit.
He's still getting it now.
And he's still getting it. Hope it makes him happy. A man named Babius Philinus set up several monuments to himself in ancient Corinth. 4, I think. And one was an impressive circular structure that was right on the forum, the agora. Now, it's worth noting that the pursuit of honor was not limited to the men at the apex of society. They had the big bucks to get the big honors, but this was part of the culture all the way from the top to the bottom. So a little piece of evidence from a different city, Philippi, is this. There's a shrine to a Latin god, Silvanus. And at one point, all of the people who belonged to the congregation, they chipped in to do all sorts of things to get the shrine established and set up and everything. And the inscription in Latin, it wasn't in English, this is the translation. They all wanted to get credit for what they had done, even though some of these are rather small gifts. Like someone paid for a painted board of Olympus. Okay, so there's a little picture, but there was a picture, and I paid for it, and I want credit for the fact that I paid for the picture. So this honor seeking is throughout the whole culture. And all of the people in the Christian community in Corinth have grown up and absorbed this culture. It's all a part of them.
Here's a quick question. A denarius, would that have represented a day's labor, or how much?
Probably, I can't get too specific. I'm not an expert.
Or
I should say it's roughly what a manual laborer would earn in a day, which would be enough to support a guy and his wife and a couple of kids for the next day, that kind of thing. Yeah, so 15 denarii is something. It's really not a huge amount of money, but who was it? Gaius Horatius Sabinus wanted credit for it. So now in the patriarchal society, also one thing we could note in passing here, in this status-conscious, honor-seeking society, Paul's insistence on supporting himself by manual labor was an embarrassment. The farther you got from manual labor, the better for your honor. And we can see in 2 Corinthians chapter 11 that Paul working with his hands is considered demeaning by other members of the Christian community. They don't like it. So it's the men who are competing for the glory. The women are kind of the instruments of their competition. And the women's self-presentation in public is part of the men's presentation of themselves. The family honor and glory and prestige is expressed and enhanced by the way the women dress. You dress very expensively. Huh?
The trophy wives.
The trophy wives are on display, and the trophy daughters, so to speak, are on display all the time. So the way they dress, and also, unfortunately not shown with these statues, the way they have their hair is very important for their self-presentation, which is not, it's not their individualistic self-presentation that's going on. It's they're a member of this family or that family or that family, and it's the family that's glorified in this way.
I was going to ask if they were related to St. John the Baptist.
They all lost their heads, but their heads have not been discovered, so that's a difference.
Okay.
John the Baptist. The issue of hairdos comes into 1 Corinthians chapter 11, as we'll see, women's hairdos. Boys, worth noting something about the boys. I don't have anything to say about the girls because they were not trained for leadership in the city. But the boys, especially like in the more elite families, they're trained for this competitive, honor-seeking life that they're going to have as men. These upper-class boys, when they're younger, they have tutors that come and take care of them. Tutors are actually mentioned by Paul in his letter to the Galatians. But then when they got to like their mid-teens, they spent a year or two at a place called the Gymnasion. So there was a Gymnasion in Corinth, but there's not much to see of it. However, in Sikion, which is a nearby Greek city, you can see the ruins of the Gymnasion. So you can see that there's a courtyard, which would have been used for military training and athletics. And then around it were rooms, which were used, I mean, some of it was for storing equipment, but other rooms were used for courses, lectures, musical performances, poetry reading, that sort of thing. And so the Gymnasium was a place for the guys to work out, to finish their formal education, and also to just hang out, chill. So, and once they graduated, it continued to function as kind of like the men's club for the men of the town. So one reason for mentioning this is in these, the Gymnasium would be a venue for performances of various kinds, including rhetorical performances. Speaking is a very highly regarded thing in this culture, and people who are well trained to be excellent persuasive speakers are highly regarded. And a lot of the philosophers, philosophical kind of people are of this sort. And so the men's club Gymnasium would be a setting where visiting philosophers would come and offer the kind of wisdom which Paul subjects to severe criticism in 1 Corinthians 4, as we'll see. And finally, on the subject of social stratification in Corinth, we should mention slavery. That same market where we looked at the remnants of some of the shops was the place for the slave market. And there was a considerable slave trade in the Eastern Mediterranean, and Corinth was one of the major centers for the slave trade in the Eastern Mediterranean. So humans were traded in downtown Corinth. Estimates vary. One estimate is that a third of the inhabitants of the cities in this period were slaves. And clearly members of the Christian community in Corinth are enslaved. 1 Corinthians 7, 21 to 23 addresses the slaves in the community. Aristotle said that slaves are talking tools, and that's how they were treated. Whether they were being subjected to very demeaning manual work or whether they were employed in tutoring or whatever it was demeaning, it was shameful to be a slave. You were kind of like a non-person. Aristotle says you can't have a friendship with a slave because he's a slave. Interesting, a couple of years ago in Pompeii, the archaeologists unearthed this, it's kind of like a tool shed, garage kind of thing. There was a chariot pole here and other tools, and bedding for 3 people and a chamber pot. So apparently 3 of the slaves in the villa, this was on the property of the villa, 3 of the slaves lived in the tool shed. So just perfectly fulfilling Aristotle's view of slaves as talking tools. So just to review for a second, you have this big chasm between the upper class and everybody else in Corinth. And it's not only economic, it's cultural, it's a matter of who's honored and who's dishonored. And it's not a chasm that's easily bridged socially. And also the whole thing has an ethos of self-seeking. You're self-seeking for yourself, for your family, and maybe in some ways for your city, Corinth, against other cities. But it's not an ethos of social solidarity. We're like we're all part of this one society, and those who are better off have a tremendous concern for those who are less better off. It's not that kind of ethos. And you can see that Paul's confronting this ethos in the minds of the Corinthians who have become Christians and become part of the Christian community, but their thinking was not entirely changed. Let's see, other aspects of the culture here. We should mention sexual immorality. Demosthenes, 4th century BC speaker, was a speaker, said something which continued to be true for centuries. He said, speaking to other wealthy men in Athens, he said, "Mistresses we keep for the sake of pleasure, concubines for the daily care of the body, and wives to bear us legitimate children." So this is a very instrumental view of women on the part of the men who have the financial resources to live out such an instrumental view of women. And within this view of women, prostitution is just a totally culturally accepted reality. There's none of the brothels of Corinth have been excavated. Again, looking at Pompeii, because it's from the same era. This is the brothel at Pompeii. Now, at the same time, there were contrary currents regarding sexuality in Corinth at this time. Some people were going in the opposite direction, away from sexual activity of any kind. A kind of sexual asceticism was in the air. The cult of Isis was spreading from Egypt and various cities in the Eastern Mediterranean, and the cult of Isis cultivated an abandonment of an abstention from sexuality, and looked at Cancrea earlier, Cancrea, the port city just to the east of Corinth, and it's known that there was an Isis cult, an Isis temple in Cancrea. And we see some of both of these things in 1 Corinthians, because guys going to prostitutes is mentioned in chapter 6. But then also in chapter 7, we have this section. It's good for a man not to touch a woman. That's this kind of going in the opposite direction, sexual asceticism thing going on. Okay, so the Corinthians enjoyed various recreations of the sorts that people in these Greco-Roman cities did. In addition to the big open-air theater, there was a smaller roofed theater called an Odeon, Odeon, a place where you have singing. So because it's small and roofed, it's more suitable for musical concerts, poetry reading, lectures, that sort of thing. The remains of the Odeon are not too impressive in Corinth. This is the remains of the Odeon in Amman, Jordan. It used to have a roof. But you can see it's a much smaller venue. And this also would be an ideal place for visiting philosophers to come and give talks to the public. The kind of people that Paul is going to take his stand against in the first chapters of 1 Corinthians, the wise. Near Corinth, on the Isthmus, there were athletic games every few years. The Greeks had 4 different Olympic-type games. The Olympic Games and these Corinthian, the Isthmian Games of Corinth, and 2 others. And they were a big deal. People came from all over Greece. And they were administered from Corinth. So let's see. So there's a stadium for horse racing. The remains are not too impressive, but again, we can look at others. This one's in Amman, Jordan. This one is in Caesarea in modern Israel. So these were for chariot racing. And you could do other things there too. This plaque shows a guy driving the chariot, and there's another guy next to him. He's a soldier in full battle attire, and what he's doing is he's jumping on the chariot and jumping off the chariot in all of his weighted armor. It's a kind of a display of strength and agility. Huh?
As the chariot moves around.
As the chariot moves around, he jumps on and jumps off.
Chariots of fire.
It's a chariot of fire, if things go wrong. Let's see, there was also a racetrack for runners, for foot races, with a mechanism making sure that no one did a false start. And at the site of the track, archaeologists have they've recreated the little device for the runners. So these games were familiar to the Corinthians, to all the Corinthians, and certainly to all the Christians in Corinth, and to Paul. He speaks about foot racing in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. And there were rougher entertainments, because closer to the city than the games was the amphitheater, which was a place for blood sports. Again, the remains in Corinth are not too impressive, but this is the remains of an amphitheater today in southern Israel, which was built for a legion of Roman soldiers who were stationed nearby, so that they would have the kind of entertainments they liked. Lower level is where the animals were kept until they were ready for the combat, and then there was an elevator that brought them up to the surface. And the gladiators came in at the south entrance, and if they died, they were carried out at the north entrance. Now, the athletic games and the blood sports in the amphitheater were a very big deal. Lots of people. And running them was a very important and prestigious thing. And so to be the master of the games was something that the very wealthiest Corinthians aspired to do at least once in their lifetime. And there are inscriptions, I'll just flip through these quickly, of some of these guys. He was president of the games. He did various things, but this was the big one. This guy also was the president of the games. That was the apex of his career. You could see one after another, these guys, they wanted to memorialize this. Was really important to them and their families. My dad was the master of the games here. My grandfather was master of the games. This is a big thing for our families. They, without going into the details, they celebrate this course of honors, which I mentioned earlier. Like, that the guys served in the various city offices, in this case, leading up to the supreme position he could have, which was master of the games. And it's been said that Paul presents God's plan of salvation as involving the Son of God in a negative course of honors, a course of the relinquishment of honor. This goes on and on. For example, Philippians 2, which says, the divine thing, which is what the Son did. The Son did the divine thing, which was to relinquish glory and to descend into the lower position, and then to descend into the lowest position, the position of shame and humiliation. And what did I do with that? I consider it so much rubbish. I threw it all away, because none of that was directly relevant to becoming a follower of Jesus, which was a supremely important thing. Okay, so now let's see, just a tad of historical background. Where are we for time? Okay, so Corinth was actually not an old city when Paul was there. There had been an old city, Corinth, the Greek city, which was destroyed by the Romans roughly around the year 150. And they depopulated the city. They killed all the men and took the women and children as slaves.
Which year, I'm sorry, which year was that?
The thing is, I think it was 146. I think 146 BC. But about a century later, in 44 BC, Julius Caesar, in one of his last acts before he was assassinated, refounded Corinth as a Roman city, as a Roman colony. Not because the countryside was empty, but in order to have a city in the area where everyone was very loyal to the regime, because they were going to be from Rome or from Italy and brought in and empowered to have a Roman city there. So the first citizens of this new Corinth were Romans. And when Paul was there around the year 50, the city was less than 100 years old. It was settled mainly, it seems, or the leading settlers were freed men. They had been slaves, but had been set free. And many of them had been slaves of extremely wealthy families. And so when they became freed, they continued their relationship with these families, and they worked as their agents and representatives in trade and business in the Eastern Mediterranean. So some of these people these freed men became very wealthy. We saw Babius Philetus's monument to himself. He was one of these very wealthy freedmen. So as a Roman colony, Corinth was a bit of Rome in the middle of Greece. The city constitution was modeled on that of Rome. That's why the director of public works was called an aedile, remember? It's a Latin term for their office in Rome, and also why the meat market identifying plaque is in Latin, because Latin is the base language for this city. It's very Roman. So as a Roman colony, the whole identity of the city is based on loyalty to the regime. And loyalty to the regime is expressed in, above all, loyalty to the imperial family. And this, you see this very much in Corinth.
But Paul writes to them in Greek,
Yes.
which is that itself kind of subversive? Like, is that he's talking to not elites by doing that, or?
Well, I think by this time, the city was founded in 44 BC. And that's when was the big influx of people from Italy, who are Latin speaking. So probably by this time, there are still some people in Corinth who speak Latin. But probably also everyone speaks Greek.
Right.
And Latin is probably by this time, a century after a century from its founding, Latin is becoming more like the formal official language rather than what most people are speaking at home.
Right.
Yeah. So for example, on the east side of the Forum, it's a big building which is dedicated to the veneration of the imperial family. These are statues that were discovered on the site.
Augustus.
This is Augustus and his two nephews whom he adopted, but they didn't live to be very old. They are shown in what's called heroic nudity. This shows them to be heroic in stature. It's not how they walked around the city streets. Also found here statues of Julius Caesar and Nero, who when Paul was there was not yet emperor, but he was going to become emperor shortly after that. So holding this, this place for venerating the imperial family in mind. Okay. So here's the agora, courtyard, which by the way is bigger than the one in Rome. It's 160 meters long. It's really a big deal. This was a big, splendid city. Anyway, in the middle of the plaza was a statue of Augustus. So this was probably a larger than life bronze statue of Augustus, of the kind of which they turned out hundreds and even thousands of these images of the emperor, all pretty much cookie cutter, models of each other, and were spread all over the empire because it's an expression of reminder daily to everybody who's in charge here. So a big statue, probably of this sort, although this is a marble one from Thessalonica. In the agora, in the courtyard there, the square, he's got the building honoring the imperial family at his back, and in front of him is this big temple, probably to Apollo, who is the god of his family. So you have him standing there in the center of the city, looking out over the city to the god Apollo, to the divine realm. What it's saying to everybody is not just that Augustus is the ruler, it's saying that he's the one that the gods have put in place to rule the human sphere. And how is it that the gods give us security and peace? Through Augustus. The whole architecture of it declares this. So it's not just expressing a political commitment of the social elite, expressing a whole worldview, which the Christian community, of course, is on collision course with this worldview, because Paul and the believers in Corinth acknowledge as the real Jesus of Nazareth, who was put to death by a Roman prefect. And at the beginning of 1 Corinthians, you could track, Paul immediately starts talking about God and Jesus Christ, the Lord, Jesus Christ, the Lord. In the first 8 verses, he refers to Jesus as Lord, right at the beginning of 1 Corinthians. The inscription on the statue, it says, what's it? Oh, yes, the inscription says, "Sacred to the divine Augustus." That is, the statue is sacred. The inscription is also, this is interesting, it's from, it's identified as being paid for by a group called the Augustales, the Augustus guys. And this is a group of freedmen who are very wealthy, and they club together. They have their social occasions and whatever together, and their stated purpose is to honor the Emperor Augustus. And they weren't the only group. There were at least 3 other associations in Corinth at the same time with the same purpose, in one way or another, of worshiping the emperor. It's a very civic-minded thing to do in Corinth. And so you can see how countercultural, dangerously countercultural Christianity is, which has a different view of who's Lord and how the world is constructed. And because Corinth is a Roman city in which loyalty to the regime is uppermost in the minds of the people who are running the city, anybody who doesn't seem to buy into this dedication and devotion to the imperial family is going to arouse suspicion. Like, why are you out of sync with this? Where are you at? Are you hostile? Are you a troublemaker or what? And the Romans were very suspicious, the upper class, they're very suspicious of associations, groups of people. As you get people together, there's lots of room for people to be unhappy about the way things are in the Roman Empire. If people get together in groups, it's not unlikely that they'll start sharing their unhappinesses and talking about it. And that talk may move on to action. So, so one of the things which is not welcome is new religious groups which are not sort of licensed and recognized by the government. And the issue of whether the Christian community in Corinth is that kind of group is something that comes up. In fact, it comes up in an incident which happens very close to this statue. So close to the statue is this this kind of outdoor installation for the governor to preside over certain public events. In fact, built into the statue is bench seating. So you can imagine yourself sitting at the base of the statue here and looking out at the bema, where the governor is going to be, this outdoor platform. There remains today. Around the other side, the archaeologists have put up a slab of white marble and some better marble fragments that they've found, just to give an idea of how grand it would have looked. Originally would have been clad in brilliant marble. So if you look at Acts 18, you read about an incident which occurs right here. When Gallio, the proconsul of Achaia, was proconsul of Achaia, the Jews rose up together against Paul and brought him to the tribunal. That is, this platform, saying, "This man is inducing people to worship God contrary to the law, Roman law." Roman law is the law we have here in Corinth. This is a Roman city. And people can't just go off starting new religious groups and encouraging other people to join them. Dangerous thing. It says, Luke says, "But when Paul was about to reply, Gallio spoke to the Jews. He says, 'If it's a matter of some crime or malicious fraud, I should with reason hear the complaint of you Jews. But since it's a question of arguments over doctrine and titles and your own law, see to it yourselves. I don't wish to be the judge of such matters.' And he drove them away from the tribunal." If you're sitting on the bench there at the base of the statue, it's a lot of activity to see here. So they all then seized Sosthenes, the synagogue official, and beat him in full view of the tribunal. But none of this was of concern to Gallio. So in the Roman Empire, Judaism was one of the acknowledged, officially sanctioned religions. generally non-Jews didn't admire Judaism, but it was allowed. And so the Jews could have like their own community functions, and they could have their own Jewish law within their Jewish communities. And they were not expected to do some things which were abhorrent to Judaism, but which Romans would expect, like offering homage to the emperors. It's like, okay, we know Jews don't do that, but they do pray for the emperor in their temple in Jerusalem, and they don't cause trouble, so we're just going to live with that. That's the status quo. So as long as the Christians are perceived by the Romans, the Roman government, as being part of Judaism, the government doesn't care. And that's what Gallio was saying. He's saying, I don't know who these people are, but, well, actually, he seems to be informed. He must have been informed by people on his staff as to who Paul is and why the Jewish community is in turmoil and what the trouble is. And the view he's gotten is this is an intra-community thing among the Jews in the city. And so he says, I don't have to get into that. I got enough other things to do. So, but if the Christians begin getting perceived by the Roman authorities as not part of Judaism, then all of the weight of disapproval that comes down on licensed groups is going to come down on them.
But just pointed out, the Jews prayed for the emperor in the temple, and that's something the Christians carried on from Judaism, praying for the emperor.
Yeah, you see, it's in one of the
It's in Peter.
pastoral letters.
Peter talks about it too.
Yes, that's right. Yes, right. First Peter, yeah.
So that it's really fascinating to see that in its political context, the fact that there were political reasons to do that, as well as our religious reasons,
Right,
our
right.
faith reasons for doing that.
Right.
There's also political reasons for doing that. That's something that is a behavior that identifies us with our Jewish heritage, might make us more accepted and tolerated than
By the Roman authorities. Possibly, if they knew that the Christians are praying for the emperor.
Right.
Maybe.
Like help get
Possibly.
a pass from time to time.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay, anyway, this brings us to the subject of religion, so I want to say just a few things about this. So going back to our aerial view, a lot of the downtown area is temples and the temple precincts. One was an especially impressive temple, an old temple from the Greek period, in the Greek city remains of it. In Paul's time, it probably would have resembled this Greek temple in southern Italy, Paestum. So the temples were not just places where some religious professionals in the pagan religions did stuff. They were part of the city, So we have all these temples, and the different gods and goddesses have their different festival days. And these are the days off in Corinth. You don't have Labor Day and July 4th or stuff like that. You have the Feast of Apollo and the Feast of Aphrodite and the Feast of so-and-so and so-and-so. When it's their feast, that's the day off. And then there are big public events. So a statue of the god or goddess might be paraded, processed through the streets, and the procession comes back to the grounds of the temple, and then there's big animals are sacrificed, and then the remains are cooked up, and you have feasting, and you have wealthy people in town who are paying for the animals and paying for the wine, and maybe giving out some coins to people, and so on. This is a prominent part of life in Corinth, and it's not easy to not take part. You just sit home. I said, what's wrong with you? This is us, the city of Corinth. Who are you now? Aren't you part of this city?
Not very patriotic.
Huh?
It's not very patriotic.
Not patriotic. Right, don't you love Corinthian society? What are you, antisocial? Sometimes the early Christians got referred to as atheists. It's like we reject all of the gods and goddesses upon whose favor society depends. It wasn't just the festivals. Religion was more woven into the whole options in Corinth. Or there's two fountain houses where you can get water. They have religious associations. This one, called Glauce, is connected with a mythical event, which is featured in one of the plays of Aeschylus. the event was supposedly took place here at this well, which is inside and down below. And the other fountain is called Kyrene, which is named after a woman in another Greek myth. She broke into tears of grief, and the gods turned her tears into the fountain. Artemis had accidentally killed her son. So when you need water, you have to visit these sites where gods and goddesses were thought to have been active. There's the Kyrene fountain. Next door to the Kyrene fountain, the meat market, as we said before. Well, the meat comes from the temples. The animals are slaughtered in the temples as sacrifices to gods. It's the meat market. So, for example, the temple area that I said earlier might have been a temple of Apollo. And the outside there's a big long altar for burning up sacrifices. So this is where the meat comes from. The animals are given to the temples. The priests sacrifice them. They butcher them. The butchers in town are the priests. And a lot of the meat ends up in the meat market being sold, which brings revenue to the temple because it pays the priests' salaries and money, and the profits go to the temple. So, so if you buy meat in the meat market, do you feel like you're completing the sacrifice? I mean, that's what happens in the temple. The animal is sacrificed. There's prayers. The animal is sacrificed. Means part of it is burnt up on the altar and given to the god. And the rest of the animal is butchered, roasted, and eaten by the participants in the sacrifice. Eating the sacrifice temple of Apollo. This morning the animal was sacrificed. They sent some of it up to Apollo in smoke, and the rest of it is here for me to take home and have for dinner. Do I feel like I'm participating in an Apollo sacrifice if I buy the meat? This is an issue that Paul deals with in 1 Corinthians, as we'll see in chapters 8 to 10.
Would the Jewish community have similar reservations about that meat?
Oh, yeah, I don't think they would eat any of that meat.
Because
No.
Yeah.
They wouldn't touch it, I don't think.
So
But it seems that most of the members of the community, the Christian community in Corinth, are non-Jews. Right? So they've grown up with all of these connections and associations and lifestyle.
yeah.
One particular temple in town is worth noting. The Greeks not only had sort of like the true gods like Apollo and Zeus, but they also had sort of like divinized men and started out as a legendary person, but then gradually became regarded as part of the divine realm. One of them was this guy Asclepius and his daughter, whose name I can't remember. Anyway, he had a temple in Corinth. And in the ruins of the temple, the archaeologists have found these terracotta models. So people would go to the temple of Asclepius, they would offer sacrifices. They might, under certain circumstances, even stay overnight. They'd come, they'd have a meal, then they would sleep there to see if the god would appear to them in a dream and offer them healing. Anyway, and do some ritual cleansing and whatever. Anyway, if they experienced healing, they would say, "Oh, Asclepius healed me." And as a thank you to Asclepius, they'd go to the guy who made these sorts of things and buy, like my broken arm got healed. I'll buy an arm, and they go put it in the temple of Asclepius to honor the god, so that when people come to his temple, they say, "Oh, look at all the people that the god healed. He's a powerful god."
You can go to Mexico, Central America, and the churches will see little, silver models of a child or an arm, a leg, an eye, or whatever.
Ex votos.
Ex votos.
Yes, right. In Europe too. Yeah.
In Ohio
Yeah.
too.
Yeah, that's in there.
Yeah.
But it's run by the Franciscans.
There's a shop.
Yeah.
Or many things.
Here's the thing about Asclepius, which is of interest to us at the moment. Okay, so here's the layout of the Asclepius complex, right? So there's an altar, an outdoor altar there for burning up the victims. There's the temple building, that's the roofed building, which has a statue of Asclepius in it, the cult statue. The abattoir where they do the butchering. And then there's the courtyard. Okay, there's a side view of the whole thing. So in the courtyard, on the left-hand side, are dining rooms. These things here are, they're stone benches. And the idea is you would bring pads, quilts, blankets or whatever, and lay them out on the benches, and then you eat reclining on the benches. And the little central thing is where the slaves bring in the food and set out the trays and stuff. So this is where you, so here's the point. This is where or hire out a restaurant or a cabin for an event or something, you have the temple. Presumably the other temples have this sort of thing too, but here it's excavated in Corinth, the Asclepius temple. So you have a dinner party for your family or for business associates, get together, whatever. Here's an invitation from Egypt, but it's from this period. You might get this kind of invitation. Chirimon requests your company at the table of the Lord Serapis, the Egyptian god, at the Serapeum, Serapis' temple, tomorrow, the 15th at 9 o'clock, where the first birthday of a daughter is to be celebrated at a meal in the Serapeum. So here you have just devotion and socializing are just combined in a way that you can hardly distinguish the two. Do they think that Serapis has blessed their daughter? Sure, blessing comes from the gods, and they probably have a devotion to Serapis, and they have a little Serapis bronze statue at home and that kind of thing. So they go to his temple to celebrate the daughter's first birthday. She lived through the most dangerous year of her life. She survived to 1 year old. We're going to thank the god. Is it also just, from another perspective, just primarily a social thing? And it's not like everyone's very devout or pious or devoted to Serapis, but he's just like in the background. Like people celebrate Christmas, they buy Christmas gifts and exchange them. You say, Christ Mass, oh, these people are Christians. And no, they're just celebrating Christmas. They're not necessarily religious. It's just a gift-giving thing that you do in December. So, and anyway, you can't tell how religious the people are. But the thing is religious. It's in the temple. It's the meat sacrifice to Serapis, or here Asclepius, which is going to end up, it's going to go through the abattoir and end up, it gets cooked and ends up on your table here. So if you are a Christian now, do you go when Chirimon invites you? Do you go or not? Say, well, it's my cousin. How can I not go? Says, it's Serapis. How can you go? Or this is the guy that, I have a construction business and I do a lot of work for this guy. He's the contracts with him keep my business going. He invites me to come because it's his daughter who's survived to 1 year old. I'm not going to go. I'm going to insult him by not going. How am I going to survive economically if I break my relationship with him? So, okay, let's see. We have time for just very briefly, a few remarks about stuff that we can't exactly see here, which is, final remarks on all this religious stuff. Corinth is a religious place, as well as being a religious place that's religiously dedicated to honoring the emperors and everything. And this is not like a big anonymous modern city where you can kind of move in and out without getting to know a lot of people or people getting to know you. It's not like that. And so there's not a lot of room here socially to back off from any of this or to get a separate space in which to have a life together which doesn't share in all of this religious stuff and all of these social and political values. And so it's really going to be hard to be a community. And Christianity isn't something you just do in your head. Like I have some particular ideas, I have some books in my house, and these are the thoughts I think when I read my books. Christianity is a social thing. It's a community thing. Well, how do you get a community of people to exist in a city like this? Very difficult. So that's background not only to 1 Corinthians, but all of the letters, and including kind of the letters in the book of Revelation to those 7 cities where the Christian communities are. They're living in the midst of all this kind of pressure. Okay, finally, briefly, just something about the Christians. These are named people that we know of in the community in Corinth about the time that Paul writes to them. Without going into the details, Gaius seems to have been a wealthy person. These guys seem to have been well off. These people are in business. We don't know how well off they are. And these people seem to be slaves.
Any chance that's the Erastus who was mentioned in the
A
story?
lot of people have thought so, but the current best thinking is it's not the same person. That the Erastus who's mentioned in Romans was not as wealthy as that.
Okay.
He had a lower position probably in the administration of the city. The community can't be, it's not a legal entity, so it can't possess property. So where does the community meet? They might meet in rented rooms. Someone in the community could rent a room, like maybe downtown, there might be some rooms where you can rent a space, possibly. But probably in general, they met in homes. Well, whose homes? I mean, if you live in and work in a place like that, there's not much room to meet. You get a few people there in the downstairs, but not a lot. Presumably, their scholars say the better off members of the community would have a somewhat larger house, and that would enable them to be the hosts for the Christians getting together. Now, this is the floor plan of a house from the 2nd century in Corinth, not the first. And nobody knows whether it's typical of the houses in Corinth. Maybe not. But it is at least from Corinth in the same era, and it's interesting to look at for the purpose of, number one, thinking about numbers, and also how you would celebrate the Lord's Supper. So this is a nice house. This is the mosaic floor with panther there. This was a nice house. So a person would have to have some money to own this house. This is a well-off person, but it's not a huge place. So the dining room is like maybe 15 by 20 feet. Okay, so it's a good size. It has installations for reclined seating, like in the Ask Me that I showed you. So how many people could you get there? Well, with the built-in seating and the triclinium in the dining room, maybe more than a dozen, but not maybe a lot more than a dozen. And then there's this area. This is like a courtyard area, the atrium. The impluvium is open in the middle to the sky, and it has a shallow water feature down on the floor. So around it, it's not designed for sitting in, but you could bring some chairs in, or people could sit on the floor. So some people could sit there. How many? I don't know, maybe another 15 people. Are you getting up to 30 people? Maybe, but maybe not. Now, how do they celebrate the Lord's Supper? Maybe not all in the same room. And what if, and as I said, okay, we'll come back and talk about this later when we get to the section in 1 Corinthians about the Lord's Supper. But this is the background. Anyway, how many people were in this community in Corinth at the time that Paul writes to them in maybe the year 53 or 54? Who knows? But the estimates are not very large that you find in the scholarly literature. One scholar says, well, there were at least 30, which means maybe not more than 30, or not a lot more than 30. Another scholar, 30 to 50. That would mean maybe you have 2 or 3 houses like this. Another scholar says the whole church, that means like if you got if there were smaller family groupings and you got them all together on occasion, maybe you're talking 40 to 45 people, or maybe as much as double that size. So we're getting up to 90. And another scholar says, well, if you included all of them in Corinth and the ones in Cenchreae, that little port city nearby, maybe you get up to 100 people. Now, these scholars don't know. Maybe the numbers were larger, but that's 4 different scholars there giving their views. They don't think there was a lot of people. So that's, just as a final note, that's pretty interesting. I think we're a pretty small church.
Like to-
But, so if you look around on a Sunday, you say, wow, there's only 60 people here. If you go in any Roman Catholic church, I mean, I've never been in a Roman Catholic church with only 60 people for one liturgy on a weekend. Maybe they exist, but I've never seen that.
And that's-
We're talking about hundreds or even
Countryside.
thousands of people.
Right.
But anyway, so if you look around on a Sunday, say, there's only 60 of us here. You know, there might only have been 60 people in the Christian community in Corinth when Paul wrote 1 Corinthians.
There were 77 today.
Today there was.
So today we had a big Sunday. Okay, so, all right, I went over time, sorry, but,
Thank you.
let's, come back to this next week.
You talked about slave in two different concepts. So when we're reading scripture, I mean, one is the master-slave relationship.
Right?
Like when I looked with Dr. Williamson, I got a lot of teaching on master-slave relationship.
Uh-huh.
And so the other slave, I mean, would it, in Greek or Hebrew, would it be different word that's used for those two things, or? You know what I mean?
Well, the Greek has the word doulos, which means slave.
Okay.
Slaves were at every, when we looked at the, that breakdown of, like the division into different, social classes or
Mhm.
economic levels, where was that? Slaves are tucked in at every level, because there are some who belong to the emperor's household.
Yeah.
So they're living in very splendid setting, and they may have very responsible jobs.
Okay.
So-and-so may be a slave in Augustus' household, but he gives directions and people listen. Probably nobody down here is going to own slaves, but here, you might have people who have a workshop like the one we saw. Maybe they have that little fast food restaurant, and they have husband and wife, a couple of children, and a young woman who's a slave, and they all live there. So she's living at the same near subsistence level as they are. If their business is doing okay, all 5 of them are going to eat every day. If their business drops off, they're all going to go a little bit hungry. So the slaves, but slavery is a shameful status. Nobody wants to be a slave. It's not like, well, I'm a wealthy slave, so I'm okay. Because the freedmen like Babius Philinus and the guys who put up the Augustus statue, they didn't want to be slaves. They were glad to get freed, and they have to continue their relationship with their former owner. But now I'm a freed man, and my children will be free. And they'll get farther and farther away from the shame, the humiliation of having been enslaved. So people, if they could move away from slavery, they get.
If a person was freed after having children, would their children be freed or free?
I think that would be a matter of negotiation.
I see.
Yeah, because the children in the household belong to no hands.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, so we're done for today, and next week we'll start with the actual.
Fascinating, thank you.
First Corinthians.
So next week we'll have to.
You know, and even in modern
Yes,
Greek,
next week I don't have to say anything. It'll be better.
even in modern Greek, the word for work is slavery.
That's about right.
Doulos. And
That's how I feel about work,
and the
Martin.
stratification it's right in the language. For example, the word for employee is hypothalios, which means he who is beneath
Right. Jeez.
the others.
Goodness,
So you're,
pretty clear cut there.
yeah,
Well, we use the terms superior, my superior at work. We use that word.
right.
Yeah. Yeah.
I've actually, in England, I actually heard someone, who's the better man here? he was referring to who was the boss.
Who's the boss, right? The better man.
Oh, yeah, well, people say
That's,
that's no way to relate to your betters,
To your better.
Correct,
right?
yeah, I've heard
meaning
that.
the people who are in the higher social, right?
Those
Yeah,
who
I
know-
feel like that's
those-
getting archaic, though, that expression. But yeah.
Yeah,
you
well, it
hear
was British.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They're very honest about it.
Yeah.
thank you, Kevin.
Oh, yeah,
Yeah.
Very
Thank you.
interesting.
thank you for listening.
Yeah, very good stuff.